If you don't know what's most important on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, zoom out a little bit further. If you don't know what your month priorities should be, well, what are your quarterly priorities? If you don't know what your quarterly priorities should be, what are your yearly priorities? If you don't know what your yearly priorities are, then what are your life priorities? Like, what are your overall goals for your life? That can help answer the question of what's meaningful and what's not, because at the end of the day, on our deathbed, we're not going to care all that much about other people's priorities. More so, how did we show up for the things that we really felt like were valuable, or how we wanted to gift our life back to the world? I'm in this really interesting space running the Monk Manual because in some ways we tend to attract people who are interested in a greater level of fullness, often are ambitious, often have subscribed to a lot of productivity thinking, modern productivity thinking. And now we're coming against this question of how do I reconcile all this doing in my life and move forward onto this path of being? There's a recognition that feels like something is missing that they'd like to manifest more fully in their life. I find that the vast majority of individuals who are coming to the Monk Manual are trying to figure out how to reconcile these two parts of their experience. Feeling like they need to be doing, and this feeling that even amidst all that doing, no matter how much they do, there's something deeper that they're really after. Now, one of the first premises that needs to be challenged here is that doing and being are opposed. I remember when I first launched the Monk Manual, we would run some different ads. And sometimes I'd have people say, hey, this all sounds really great, but I can't be a monk. I have bills to pay. I have a mortgage. I have kids I need to send to school. And you could see buried in that this tension of believing that the real way that you achieve being is that you have to have hours that you set aside for meditation or for prayer or just space, right? Just having all this space. And that the pressures of modern day life inhibit us from actually being able to experience those things. What I want to suggest is that, in fact, being and doing are not actually opposed, but only appear to be so. Doing is the external, concrete activity of our lives. It's how we experience time in a linear way, in a quantitative way, thinking about all these different tasks, what we're going to do at this time, what we're going to do at that time. Whereas being is our experience of time on an internal level. What's important to note here is that the external piece does not necessarily dictate the internal reality. So what we're actually talking about is two different halves of how we experience life. We experience it through this more quantitative doing, and we experience it from this more qualitative being. You could be spending your day going about a lot of different tasks, and that's one level upon which you can be engaging. The being side is how much of you is actually showing up in those moments, in your receptive capacity to actually receive that which is there, to really be present, to not miss it. I like to think of it metaphorically, if you're someone who's ever done a sort of photography or you know anything about that space, a bit like having an aperture opened up. An aperture dictates how much light comes into the camera. And when we're talking about being, a lot of that is talking about how much of our internal aperture is opened up to the experience and richness of life that's around us. Now, the thing is most people who are trying to achieve this deeper level of being, maybe they feel this sense that something's missing, will often struggle to move into that because they see that being opposed to the doing. If I'm really operating from this place of being, I won't be able to do. And if I'm really doing, I'm not going to be able to be. And what I want to argue is in reality, your fullness of being and your fullness of doing are integrated. And that someone who is fully being and engaged on an internal level also needs to be engaged fully externally. So the question here is not between being or doing. The question is about engagement. It's about how much agency we're actually going to take and how much we're actually engaging in life. Not avoiding, not attacking, engaging. Now, the vast majority of people that I've worked with, and this is a common pattern I see amongst people in the Monk Manual community, is they've come to that point in life where frenetic doing no longer feels acceptable. Life feels a bit flat. Something feels drained. I would even argue to go so far as to say it feels like a spiritual problem in that there's a lack of spiritedness in what's going on. There's a lack of vitality, a lack of fullness. But the way out of this is actually rather counterintuitive. Most people, when they are experiencing this freneticism, I just have all these different things. I don't feel like I can get it all done, and therefore I'm not able to be. They'll feel like the shortcut to the path of growth and being is focusing on being. But the problem is that it's very difficult to engage on these matters of being when we have a lack of space in our external world. When we feel overwhelmed, it's very difficult for us to engage in something. And if we're feeling overwhelmed in our external environment, it's very difficult for us to deal with the chaos that might be residing within us. So the path, in a counterintuitive way, if you want to cultivate being, is actually to start with doing. Spending your energy, not so much functioning in the business of your life, but on the business of your life. There's a common idea in entrepreneurial circles that for a business owner to really go from where they are to where they need to go, especially for early businesses, they have to shift from working in their business to working on their business. And this same shift as the entrepreneurs of our own lives has to happen for us, where we're spending less energy trying to just maintain and get all of the things done, and instead focus on designing a life that creates the space that we need in order to do some of the interior work. What this is really about is putting an emphasis on creating order in your outer world. Now, one thing that monks have that is a benefit to a monk is their world is already intentionally designed. You join a monastery and everything is kind of intentionally set, right? But for us, we don't have that advantage. And as such, it's on us to approach our lives with a certain level of intentionality to create intentional systems and order in our external world. If you're someone who spent a lot of time in the productivity space or just in the workplace, we're trying to churn out more things, it's going to be difficult to fully engage this because the premises upon which we're entering into how we're looking at our doing is radically different from what most of us have been handed. Recently, I've been rereading one of the most popular time management productivity books of the last 30 years. And I will say that this particular book is very helpful for coming to some practical steps in how to order one's life. But when the emphasis of how we approach our time and our productivity is built off of a premise of getting all the things done and emphasizing efficiency, we get stuck in a pattern where no space ever actually emerges. I've lived through this myself personally, where as I was getting more and more invested in being productive, I was getting better and better at getting things done faster, being more efficient. What ultimately ended up happening was with that space, I just brought in more things. Because what I was aiming for in that was to be more productive, to produce more. In the model I'm suggesting, our goal is not to increase production. Our goal is to get clear about what matters most, make sure we fulfill those roles, but to drop a scorecard that alludes to, I have to do everything, I have to be everything to everyone, and everything has to be perfect. So instead of emphasizing, how do we try to get to the end of a never-ending to-do list? Instead, we start with, what are the actual priorities here? And we ruthlessly say no to as much as possible. This, functionally, is the same movement that ends up happening in a monastery. The system of monasticism isn't designed to just be a series of no's to a marriage or no's to a corporate career or no's to this or no to that. All the no's are designed to create space for the greater yeses. We're not trying to order our environment based around how do I get as many things done as possible, but rather, how do I stay faithful to the things that really do matter? What happens is you then enter into a phase where it's not just the order on a doing level, but it's really trying to focus on creating that space and that order, both externally and internally. And that's really the second phase, right? You start with the doing, then you move to the doing and the being. And there's a process there, right? It's an iterative process. That's why we talk about this idea of the PAR method, where you prepare and act and reflect. It creates this virtuous cycle of learning. So you spend some time in that phase. And then the third phase, your being side of life, your inner side of life, has come to such great order that now you can approach virtually any chaos externally and still have a sense of peace and joy and purpose. Because the foundation of the order that you're experiencing is internal, it's not external. So this is the path. Now, what I encourage you to do is to ask yourself the question, where am I on that journey right now? If you're someone in the first phase, I'd invite you to really focus in on how do you simplify your life? How do you minimize some of those different commitments? How do you get clear about what matters and what doesn't? If you're in the second phase, keep consistency on showing up, on being able to take the material of your life and learn from it so that you can change every single day. You can get better every single day, and your every day can get better every single day. And if you're in the third phase, that's when the emphasis really shifts to personal potency. You've reached a point where there's this internal order, and you're able to interact with that world with a certain bravery, a certain spirit of generosity, maybe even a healing spirit in the world that's so needed. So I invite you to reflect on, where are you in that journey? Are you someone who needs to focus more on getting order in how you do? Is it something where you're trying to integrate that being and doing? Or have you really solidified this being part, this internal order? And now maybe you're being invited to go back out and do in a more profound way, to share your gift with the world in a more profound way. For most of the people listening, they're going to be in that first phase. They're going to be trying to figure out, how do they create that external order? As I alluded to earlier, there are lots of really great books on how do you manage to-do lists, or how do you come up with goals. There's so many tactical things that are really widely available. So if there's something specific you're trying to learn that's tactical, go on a search engine and type it in. You'll be able to find an answer to that. What I want to emphasize instead is 2 key movements that you're probably not going to find on Google that's going to be able to help you if you're in that doing phase, to get that initial traction of more space, to then be able to further move into that second phase. The first is to shift from thinking in terms of time management to thinking instead in terms of time leadership. There's a quote by Peter Drucker that goes, "Management is the art of doing things right. Leadership is the art of doing the right things." As I already alluded to, with modern productivity, the issue that can arise is becoming more and more efficient does not necessarily lead to an outcome where you're able to focus more on that being side. In fact, for many of us, we just get caught in this vicious cycle. So rather than trying to emphasize, how do I go and do all the things and check everything off my to-do list, we're instead asking the question of what really matters. A manager is trying to make sure everything gets executed on. A leader is asking the question of what should be executed on. What matters and what doesn't? Where is there strategic alignment and where is there not? What is the vision of what I'm doing and what is the response to that vision? So we should be spending far more time operating as a time leader versus a time manager. One way that we get clear about that is by shifting from a flat, I need to do everything to-do list style way of looking at our work to instead looking at priorities. Now, the genius of priorities is that they're introducing the reality that some things matter more than other things. The problem we can get caught up in when we're trying to manage our life via to-do list is everything seems equally important. So we can spend a lot of energy just grabbing Post-it notes off the wall of whatever seems to be thing of the day, the crisis of the day, the urgent thing of the day. And we're not actually having to choose. This matters more than this. When you approach your life through the lens of priorities, you're actually having to do that work of choosing and considering what matters and what doesn't. And so what we do with the Monk Manual, and I'd recommend that you do something very similar to this, whether you're using the Monk Manual or not, is to, instead of managing your life by way of to-do lists, manage it by way of priorities. Change what your scorecard is for a day, for a week, for a month. And what I'd recommend on a very practical level is to start with the day, just set 3 priorities for the day, that if I just got these 3 things done today, I could consider this day a success. This alone gives focus and direction to your day. And it also enables you at the end of the day, for some people, for the first time, look back on their day and be like, this is what I set out to do, and I did it. And that's the gift of completion and intention that you were able to make real. And that creates a lot of positive energy and a lot of positive emotion that if you're going off of a to-do list, you're never going to really be able to experience. Now, as I said, we start with 3 priorities for the day, but ultimately what we want to work up to is actually more of a top-down approach, where you're starting with higher time horizons that can anchor daily, weekly priorities back to what really matters most. The thing is, we ask different questions and different values come to the surface dependent on our time horizon. I'm sure you've experienced this, where at the beginning of a year, you're probably asking different questions and thinking about things differently than you are on a day-to-day basis. You start thinking about, what is it that I really want out of life? What really does matter to me? Is this the right job or not? A lot of job transitions happen after the beginning of the year, that period. There's a reason for that. It's not that all of a sudden the jobs have gotten worse. It's that for a second, a lot of people are pausing and saying, hey, what do I really want? So what you want to do is anchor yourself on higher levels, answering that question of what you really want, and then base your lower level priorities off of that. What that can look like is picking 5 priorities for a month, 3 priorities for a week, and then 3 priorities for a day. As I said, you can start with the daily just to build the habit, but then approach a month, pick out what are the 5 things that really matter. Off of that, each week, pick out 3 activities that you're going to be doing that anchor back ideally to those 5 things. And then on every daily basis, you're anchoring back to the weekly perspective. What this is doing is it's counteracting the natural tendency we have to focus just on the urgent and that which creates the most emotion in us. We respond to the urgent because there's very short feedback loops on it. And often we can feel anxiety about the crisis of the day, even if that crisis is actually relatively minor. When you do this, part of what's going to happen is some things may ultimately drop. But what I want to encourage you in is that's okay, because you've already worked out that those things are not necessarily the most important things. And the actual act of choosing allocates your time and energy to be focused on the most important things. It shifts you from operating off of this flat, everything matters the same, to here's what really matters, here are the things that maybe don't matter as much, but I need to do them. And a lot of the other things, they just kind of get left behind. And that's not a problem. In fact, that's part of the solution. I keep a to-do list, and I have for about 5 years. That's a home base for all the little to-dos, all the catch-alls that I just want to get out of my head and into a place so that I don't forget about them. Now, I manage my life through priorities, and I will reference that list to sometimes pull in these different priorities or these various tasks. But what I'll end up finding is when I go through the full list every 6 months or so, 50% of the things that were to-dos, I never ended up doing, and they really don't matter. It's the sort of thing where I look at it and I think that would have been a complete waste of time to work on that. That's not even aligned with what I care about right now. You're saving yourself a tremendous amount of energy by getting clear about what you want to focus on, because as an effect, there's so many things that feel important but really aren't that you let fall away, and you don't have to spend all that mental energy on. So while that explains tactically how you can orient yourself away from to-do list thinking, away from time management to more time leadership, it doesn't necessarily answer the question of, well, how do I set priorities? Like, how do I actually know what's most important? There's 2 pieces here. One is, if you don't know what's most important on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, zoom out a little bit further. If you don't know what your month priorities should be, well, what are your quarterly priorities? If you don't know what your quarterly priorities should be, what are your yearly priorities? If you don't know what your yearly priorities are, then what are your life priorities? Like, what are your overall goals for your life? That can help answer the question of what's meaningful and what's not, because at the end of the day, on our deathbed, we're not going to care all that much about other people's priorities. More so, how did we show up for the things that we really felt like were valuable, or how we wanted to gift our life back to the world? So crowdsourcing of values and dreams really gets diminished the closer you come to the end of your life. But the other part of this is also understanding that the way we even think about priorities is heavily skewed by a methodology around goals that comes out of this modern productivity mindset. Modern productivity is so focused on production that the way we think about, in the context through which we think about good goals, is heavily skewed towards that which is mechanical and that which is controllable. You can see this really exemplified by what's probably the most common model or methodology for how we think about goals, which is called SMART goals, which asks this question: is the goal specific? Is it measurable? Is it achievable? Is it relevant? And is it time-based? All of those are helpful, and they're especially helpful if your goal is to be really concrete and efficient, if the goal is to try and drive more and more completion. But our task here is not to become efficient for efficient's sake. Our task is, how do we create the order externally that designs a life for us that's full of meaning and joy and peace? And so we have a bit of a different model of how you can go and look at your goals, a filter you can use to really assess, is this priority aligned with my greater good, or is it just production for production's sake? So to contrast against this concept of SMART goals, which is very heavily tied to this modern productivity way of thinking, which is really designed more for robots and machines than for human beings, we have something we call focusing on the good. And good here is also an acronym. Good here stands for generative, objective, operative, and desirable. Now, I want to walk you through what each of these mean because they're each filters upon which you can run something that would potentially be a priority to filter out what to say yes to and what to say no to. So the first is generative. I'm a huge believer that our lives have the potential to be a creative act, that everything we do has the potential for creating more good. So this first question, is this oriented towards being creative and generative? Is what you're doing creating more good? Is it a generative act? Now, it doesn't have to be creating good on a massive scale. You could be doing something that's relatively small and just tied to the operation of a business, for example, that you work at. And it still could be focused on the good because it's you fulfilling a role. It's you aligning maybe what you're doing with a greater good within the company or what that company's doing for a greater good. But you want to at least know that what you're focusing on is generative. If it's not generative, if it's something that actually is not creating good, it's worth questioning, is it worth doing this? The second is objective. So objective here just means that it is clear what it is that you're setting out to do. If you set a priority and it's not really clear what success looks like there, you lose the accountability piece and you lose the focus of energy and attention because you're just shooting at some really vague thing. Something that's a little bit different about the Monk Manual community versus a lot of other communities maybe focused on goal setting is we do have a lot of qualitative goals. There's a lot of things where people are focusing on the being side. They're focusing on things that are a little bit more difficult to measure in a clear way. It's not the same as complete washing all of the dishes where it's clear, okay, this is done or it's not. It might be something more of like a priority for me is focusing on being present throughout my day in this way and that way. Now, in that scenario, to use that as an illustrative example, what you can do is you can actually say, like, what would that look like for you to be operating with presence? To maybe write down specific instances of where you want to show up in that way. Anything that can go and flesh things out for you where you can have a higher level of accountability. Sometimes that comes down to refining the way that you're actually setting the priority. Sometimes that comes down to setting parameters around it. Sometimes that comes down to actually setting aside a concrete action that's tied to that is going to lead to the growth of that qualitative thing. So that's what objective means. Operative means that there is reason to believe that you doing this specific task, this specific project, this specific thing that you're trying to lean into, this action, that it is ultimately functioning towards the good that you're desiring to create. This is, again, bringing things back to this question of intentionality. Is this thing actually working towards the thing that I'm trying to work towards? If it's not, then what that means is it's likely busy work. It's likely something that's there because you feel like you need to do it, but it's not really moving the needle in any significant way. The reason that this is a powerful question or filter to run things through is because you might find that something emerges that's actually more operative for the goal that you're trying to complete. The last piece of this, having the priority be desirable, is maybe the most important piece. I think one of the great tragedies of life is when an individual builds their life in a way that they feel like satisfies what they imagine a nameless group of people want them to be, rather than actually inhabiting the deep goodness that they are and letting that come to fruition. When there's a disconnect between the good desires in themselves and the way they're actually living in their lives. This can happen in big ways with career paths that don't really align with what our actual desires are. It can happen in small ways as well, with just certain behaviors or certain ways that we proceed in a relationship that's not actually aligned with our own desires. Now, when we're asked this question of what is it that you actually want, what is it that you actually desire, does this actually align with what you desire? That can be a very terrifying question because deep down we don't really know what it is we desire. And so this filter in and of itself is going to force a certain level of honesty to say, do I even actually want this? And the reason that this is so important is because a lot of productivity and the way we think around productivity, it promises us goal achievement. It promises us focus. It promises us efficiency of getting all these things done. But the tragedy of it is if those things that we get really good at are not aligned with what it is we actually want, we're just spinning our wheels. We're just driving around the block over and over again. In fact, we may be moving backwards. So this simple question, this desirable question, is actually fundamental to any sort of efficiency equation that we want to enter into. Because you want to be really careful not to become great at building a life that you don't actually want. And that's what this desirable question introduces. Now, it's easy to hear this and want to skim over it. It can be really inconvenient to have to figure out what it is we want. But it's a necessary part of the process, because if you're not building, you're doing off of that which is connected on a deeper being level, you're always going to feel misaligned. There's few things that are actually more intimidating than facing that question of what do I actually desire and not knowing the answer. But I want to encourage you on two levels. The first is just on a very human level. This is not a one and done work. This is an ongoing work, and you don't have to expect perfection right away. As long as you're committed to the process of learning that which is within you, of leaning into those wants and figuring out what those are and committing to certain practices, you will grow over time. Absolutely, no doubt about it. Which will then enable you to make better choices around your action, because you're ordering the external environment to reflect what your internal environment is. But I also want to encourage you in that there's some very pragmatic ways that you can figure out what those things are that you really want. And I want to list now 4 different actions that you can take. And I want to encourage you at the conclusion of this time to set aside a few minutes to pick one path that you want to commit to, if you're feeling like this is an area of your life where you could use a bit more clarity. So the first path we've already talked about, and this is about zooming out. This is about figuring out what it is you really want out of your life. We have a tool in the Monk Manual community called the Life Atlas, and this can be really helpful for that. I'm not trying to sell you specifically on that process, but I do want to invite you, if you feel like you don't really know what it is you desire on a weekly, daily, monthly basis, what are these things that are generative? What are those things that are aligned for you? Zoom out, ask yourself questions. This year, what would it look like for me to really flourish? What does flourishing look like for me over the course of my life? What are the ways that I want to gift my life back to the world? What are the things that I want to experience? Who do I want to become? These are really great questions. So that's the first path. The second path is to start journaling. Now, journaling can be something that's like a daily reflection that you're doing on the day, looking at the material of your life, trying to figure out where you're experiencing unrest, when you were at your best, what's meaningful for you, what's not meaningful for you. But it also could be more informal. If you end up just committing to a practice of writing every day, of writing down your thoughts, of wrestling through a particular question you have, you will get answers. We get stuck often in our minds because the math is really complex. And if you're trying to do a really complex math problem in your head, it's hard to do. And at a certain point, it's near impossible. And that's what we can experience things to be like as well in ourselves. So take the time to start writing out those things that currently might just be more images in your head, things that feel very abstract. Start writing, because writing will bring about some clarity. The third path is to commit to an ongoing practice of reading material that either inspires you or provides you with access points to better understand who you are. The inspiration piece can be very helpful because there is a lot of fear that can come up in this whole process. So staying inspired, it's not just an ancillary thing. That's actually quite important. But we also have this type of material that we can engage in that might be based more on either practical steps or guidance, information from experts, life stories, things where we can learn through others' experience, where people can provide to us access points through which we can move forward so that we can benefit from other people's experience and not have to learn all the lessons ourselves. My recommendation would be, if you're doing this or taking on a practice of journaling, is not to just add another thing and expecting yourself to do it without taking something else away to create the space for it. If someone says, hey, I'm going to commit to running a marathon, a big point where they might end up quitting is when they're having to run for 3 hours on the weekend and they never actually create the space for that because they never said no to other things. So use something like journaling or like reading as a replacement for another activity you're already doing that's maybe not serving you as much as you like. Could be social media, could be television. You know yourself better than I do. The fourth pathway is actually the shortest path, but it also can be the most intimidating. And that is trying to progress in these areas within relationship versus on your own. Relationships function like mirrors. When you work with a coach, or you enter into some sort of community group, or you enter into even just a friendship where you're trying to hold each other accountable or talk about some of the deeper things, maybe it even could be with a spouse or a close friend. When you do that, the person that you're talking to, that you're in relationship with, is able to identify things in you and recognize patterns in you that you are not otherwise able to recognize yourself. And while that is a good thing, most of us on some level want to hide from the truths that are a bit inconvenient, the things where we're not aligned. Because when you recognize, hey, I'm not in alignment in this area, the commensurate response to that is to think, well, I need to change something. And change can be threatening. But if you're looking at choosing one of these, and if you feel like you have the capacity and the means, energy-wise or financially, I highly do recommend finding someone that you really trust, that you can enter into relationship with, where you can receive some semblance of either peer-to-peer coaching or more of a expert, student, master, apprentice sort of coaching. Because that can be a path where you really expedite your learning because you just have access to a completely different lens through which you're able to see yourself. To recap all of this, if we want to grow in our ability to experience this fullness of being, often the most pragmatic place to start is by creating order in the way we approach our doing. And one of the greatest levers upon which we can do that is through operating with a lens of priorities rather than to-dos. And I encourage you, if you're someone who already knows what you should be doing, and it's just the process of living into these priorities, of setting these priorities, go and do that. It will change your life. Absolutely. If you don't know how to set those priorities, choose one of those 4 practices that we just went through, one of those 4 pathways. Just choose one. Don't try and do all 4. If you get one down and it works great, you can always add another one later, but start with one. And if you do something, whether it's living into these priorities or whether it's just living into trying to figure out what it is you really want, you're going to be taking a courageous step forward. And as you do that, as your doing starts to create this space, you're going to see new opportunities for yourself open up. And that's an incredible place to be.